She forged my grandfather's signature on a document dated 3 weeks after he was already dead. I found that out standing in a probate courtroom in front of a judge, holding a land deed that had been in my family for 61 years. While my cousin Denise Calloway sat 4 feet away in a blazer she definitely couldn't have afforded before this inheritance fight started. She'd already told the county clerk's office that half of my grandfather's 150 acres belonged to her. She'd already hired a surveyor to mark a boundary line straight through his orchard. She'd already told my own sister I was being greedy for wanting what was legally, unquestionably mine. What Denise didn't know was that I'm a licensed land surveyor. I read property records for a living, and 2 days before this hearing, I found the one document that would end her claim, expose her forgery, and make a probate judge say 6 words I'll never forget. There is zero legal basis. Subscribe now, because what happens next gets worse for her before it gets better for me. I need to tell you something about land before I tell you what my cousin tried to steal from me. I'm Thomas Whitfield. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years working as a licensed land surveyor, which means I spend my days reading deeds, boundary stones, and county records for a living. I know what a legitimate document looks like. I know what a forged one looks like, too. That skill is the only reason I'm standing here today with my grandfather's land still in my name. My grandfather, Walter Whitfield, raised me. Not officially, not on paper, but in every way that mattered. My father left when I was 6, and my mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, so summers meant one thing: getting dropped off at Walter's farm and staying until Labor Day. That farm was 150 acres of orchard, timber, and creek bottom land in the hills, land he bought piece by piece starting in 1963, back when a Korean War veteran's land grant and a stubborn will were enough to build something that would outlast you. He taught me how to read a property line. He taught me the smell of the orchard in late August, when the apples were heavy enough to bend the branches. He taught me that land isn't just dirt. It's a record of every decision someone made to keep it, protect it, and pass it on clean. 8 months ago, Walter died. I was there for the final week, holding his hand in the same farmhouse he built with his own 2 hands. He left a will, a real one, handwritten, witnessed, dated 4 years before his death, naming me the sole heir to everything. I thought that would be the end of the story, a quiet grief, a long process of settling an estate, maybe some paperwork. I didn't know estate fraud had a face until I saw hers smiling at his funeral, like she was already measuring the porch for new furniture. That face belonged to my cousin, Denise Calloway, and within 2 weeks of burying my grandfather, she would try to take half of everything he built. To understand what Denise Calloway tried to take from me, you have to understand what my grandfather actually built, because it wasn't luck, and it wasn't inheritance money handed to him on a silver platter. It was 61 years of one man refusing to let go of a piece of ground. Walter Whitfield came home from Korea in 1953 with a bad knee, a box of medals he never talked about, and almost nothing else. He worked construction for a decade, saving every spare dollar, until a veterans land grant program let him buy his first 40 acres in 1963. That original plot was mostly scrub timber and a dry creek bed. Nobody in his family thought it was worth much. He thought it was worth everything, because it was his, free and clear, with his name on the deed and nobody else's. Over the next 30 years, he expanded it piece by piece. He bought the adjoining 20 acres from a widow who couldn't keep up the taxes. He bought the orchard plot from a farmer heading into retirement, and then spent 4 straight summers grafting apple trees by hand until the rows finally started producing fruit worth selling. He bought timber rights along the ridge. By the time I was old enough to understand any of it, the Whitfield land had grown from 40 scrappy acres into 150 acres of working orchard, hardwood timber, creek bottom pasture, and a farmhouse he built himself, board by board, nail by nail, over 2 winters. He built that farmhouse with lumber milled from his own timber stand, using a hand-drawn set of plans he sketched at his kitchen table after work. He didn't hire a crew. He didn't take out a loan he couldn't pay back in a year. He worked nights and weekends. And by the time the roof went on, half the county knew Walter Whitfield as the veteran who built his own house from the ground up, rather than the man who inherited anything. That reputation mattered to him more than money ever did. He used to tell me that anyone can be handed land, but very few people ever actually earn it, plank by plank, acre by acre, and that the difference shows up in how hard a man fights to keep it. Every deed, every survey correction, every boundary adjustment he made over those decades, he kept filed in a metal box in his study, organized by year, in his own handwriting. I didn't understand as a kid why that box mattered so much to him. I understand now. That box was the entire legal history of everything he'd built, a paper trail so clean and so complete that it would end up being the single most important thing standing between me and losing half of it. I spent every summer of my childhood on that land starting when I was 7 years old. My mother worked 2 jobs after my father left, and Walter's farm became the one stable place in my calendar. He taught me to read a property survey before I could ride a bike without training wheels. He'd walk the boundary lines with me, pointing out the old stone markers some surveyor had set in the 1960s, teaching me how to find them under decades of leaf litter and undergrowth. He taught me the orchard's rhythm, when to thin the branches, when to expect the first bloom, when the apples were heavy enough in late August to bend the limbs toward the ground. He taught me that land isn't just dirt and paperwork. It's a record of every choice someone made to hold onto something and pass it on whole. That childhood is the reason I became a land surveyor. 12 years ago, I got my license, and I've spent my career doing exactly what Walter unknowingly trained me to do since I was a kid. Reading deeds, reading boundary records, reading the difference between a document that's legitimate and one that isn't. I didn't know yet how much that skill would end up mattering. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over that farm in the evening, right after the sun drops behind the ridge and the orchard rows go gold, then gray. I can still hear the screen door on the farmhouse, the specific creak of it, the way it slapped shut a half second after you let go of the handle. I can still smell the wood stove Walter refused to replace with a furnace, even into his 80s, because he said a house should smell like something. Those aren't small details to me. They're the reason none of what happened later was ever really about money, no matter how Denise tried to frame it. My family tree matters here too, so let me lay it out plainly, because it becomes important later. Walter had 2 children. My mother, who passed 6 years ago after a long illness, and my uncle, who moved out of state decades ago and had almost no contact with the family by the time Walter got older. That's it. 2 children, and by the time Walter was in his final years, I was effectively his only close, present, direct line family member still living nearby. Denise Calloway is not Walter's direct descendant. She's the daughter of Walter's niece, which made her his great-niece, a relation close enough to be at family gatherings, but distant enough that nobody, including Walter himself, ever treated her as one of his children. That distinction matters. It's going to matter a lot in a courtroom later. Growing up, Denise was around, but never central. She'd show up at Thanksgiving, at the occasional summer cookout, always pleasant enough, always a little too interested in what everyone else had. I remember my mother commenting once, years before any of this started, that Denise had a habit of complimenting things she clearly wanted for herself. A car, a piece of jewelry, a house. It was a small, offhand observation at the time. It reads very differently in hindsight. Denise had spent most of her adult life financially unstable. 2 failed business ventures that I know of, a boutique that closed within 18 months, and some kind of consulting venture that never seemed to have any actual clients. A divorce that left her without much of anything, including, from what I later heard through family channels, a fairly ugly dispute over a shared property settlement that never quite resolved in her favor. About 18 months before Walter died, she moved back to the area and she started showing up at his farm regularly, telling anyone who'd listen that she just wanted to help care for her elderly great-uncle. I want to be fair here. On the surface, that looked like a kindness. Walter was in his 80s by then, and after a bad fall that limited his mobility, having someone nearby to check on him wasn't a bad thing in theory. But I watched the pattern up close, and it didn't take long to see what it actually was. Denise was performatively warm in front of other people, all smiles and concerned phone calls when family was watching, and controlling the second nobody else was around. She had a long family reputation, well before any of this started, for borrowing money from relatives and never paying it back. Small amounts from an aunt here, a larger sum from my own mother years earlier that was quietly written off as a loss and never mentioned again at family gatherings. She was skilled, in a way that unsettled me even before I had proof of anything, at rewriting the story of any situation so that she came out looking like the victim, and everyone else looked unreasonable. I noticed, too, how differently Denise spoke to Walter when other people were in the room versus when it was just the 2 of them. In front of family, she was attentive, doting, always mentioning how worried she was about him. Alone with him, according to what I pieced together later from a home health aide who briefly overlapped with her, she was short with him, impatient about small things, and increasingly firm about which visitors were and weren't good for his stress levels. I remember one visit, maybe 2 years before Walter passed, when Denise cornered me in the kitchen and asked, almost casually, what happens to land when somebody dies without a will? At the time, I thought it was an odd, morbid question. I didn't think much more about it. I wish I had. As Walter's mobility declined further, Denise inserted herself as his primary day-to-day caregiver. She started limiting visits from other relatives, always with a reasonable-sounding excuse, keeping things calm for his health, not overwhelming him, letting him rest. Slowly, methodically, she became the filter between Walter and the rest of his family, and none of us fully understood how isolated he'd become until it was almost too late to undo it. Looking back, I can trace the exact stretch of months where the visits from me and Rebecca, my sister, went from weekly to bi-weekly to, let me check with Denise about a good time. At the time, it felt like reasonable caution around an aging man's health. Now, I recognize it for what it was. A slow, deliberate narrowing of who got access to Walter, engineered by someone who had every reason to want fewer witnesses in the room. Walter died 8 months ago. It was peaceful. At home, in the farmhouse he'd built with his own hands. I was there for the final week. I sat with him. I held his hand. I watched him take his last breath in the same bedroom where I used to sleep every summer as a kid. I want you to remember that detail because it becomes critical later. I was a direct eyewitness to his condition and his mental state in his final days, and I know exactly what he was and wasn't capable of signing during that time. Before any of the legal chaos started, before Denise made a single move, Walter's true wishes were already on paper. 4 years before his death, he had a handwritten will drawn up and properly witnessed, naming me as the sole heir to the entire 150 acres. Not because he didn't love the rest of the family, because he trusted me to keep the land whole, keep the orchard running, and honor what he'd spent 61 years building. He'd told me about that will himself, plainly, sitting on the porch one summer evening a few years back. The orchard rose dark against a dimming sky. He said he didn't want any confusion after he was gone, and he didn't want the land carved up between people who'd never worked it, never walked its boundary lines, never learned the difference between the North Survey stake and the one a county crew had knocked loose in the 80s and never bothered to reset. He wanted it to go to someone who understood what it actually was, not an asset, a responsibility. I didn't know then how much I'd need to remember that conversation word for word in a courtroom 2 years later. At his bedside, in that final week, I made him a quiet promise. I told him I'd keep the land together. I told him I wouldn't let anyone break it apart or sell it off in pieces. I meant it as a simple comfort at the time. The kind of thing you say to a dying man to ease his mind. Not a legal commitment I expected to be tested within the month. He squeezed my hand, weaker than I'd ever felt it, and said something I've turned over in my head almost every day since. He said, "Watch the paper, not the people." I thought it was just an old surveyor's instinct talking, the kind of thing a man says when land has been his whole language for 60 years. I didn't realize until much later that it was a warning. I had no idea how literally I was about to have to keep that promise, or how soon somebody in my own family would try to force me to break it. The will reading happened 2 weeks after the funeral, in attorney Nora Fitzgerald's office downtown, a small conference room with too much fluorescent light and not enough chairs. Rebecca sat beside me. Denise sat directly across the table, dressed in black still, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue she never actually used. I remember the small details of that room more clearly than I'd like to. The hum of the air conditioning, the stack of manila folders squared perfectly on the table in front of Nora. The way Denise kept glancing at her phone under the table, as if she already had somewhere else to be, as if this reading was a formality standing between her and something she'd already decided was hers. Nora read the will exactly as Walter had written it. Handwritten, dated, witnessed by 2 neighbors who'd known him for 30 years. Sole heir, me. The entire 150 acres, the farmhouse, the orchard, the timber rights, all of it. I watched Denise's face while Nora read. She didn't cry. She didn't say a word. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, and her eyes moved from Nora to me and stayed there for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then she smiled, thin and controlled, and said, "Well, that's certainly one version of things." Nobody responded. Nora moved on to the closing paperwork. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was just grief talking. I was wrong. It was the opening move. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at my house from the probate court. Denise Calloway had filed a claim against the estate, alleging the existence of an amended will, one that gave her half of the 150 acres. According to the filing, the amendment had been signed and notarized 3 weeks after Walter's death. I read that date 4 times before it registered. 3 weeks after he died. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter, doing the math over and over, certain I was misreading it, because there was no version of reality where my grandfather signed a legal document 3 weeks after I watched him take his last breath. I didn't catch the full significance of it yet. Not fully. Grief has a way of making even obvious things blurry. What I caught, clearly, was that my cousin was now claiming half of everything Walter had spent his entire life building, based on a piece of paper that materialized after he was gone. The family fallout started almost immediately, and it moved faster than the legal process did. Denise began calling relatives, one by one, with a story that got more polished every time she told it. I manipulated Walter in his final years. I isolated him from the rest of the family. I pressured him into rewriting his wishes to cut everyone else out. She told my aunt this. She told 2 of Walter's old neighbors this. She told my own sister this. She was strategic about it, too. She never called with an outright accusation. She called sounding worried, sounding like a concerned relative, simply raising a difficult question that someone needed to ask. "I just think it's strange," she told my aunt, according to what my aunt later relayed to me, "that Thomas ended up with everything, don't you? Grandpa always said he wanted things split fairly. Walter never said any such thing, not once, not to me, not to anyone who ever repeated it back to me. But the seed was planted, and it grew fast in soil already softened by grief." By the 3rd week, I started noticing the shift in how people talked to me at the grocery store, at church, in the parking lot after Sunday service. Sympathetic looks that had a new, uncertain edge to them. A family friend who used to wave from across the lot now found a reason to look at her phone instead. Grief is isolating enough on its own. Grief paired with a whisper campaign is a different kind of loneliness entirely. Rebecca called me on a Tuesday night, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her since our mother's funeral. "Denise says you pushed Grandpa into signing something," Rebecca said. "She says you were alone with him a lot toward the end. She says it doesn't look good, Thomas." "Rebecca, I was there because he was dying," I said. "You were there too. You saw how it was." "I saw some of it," she said. "Not all of it. And she's saying things that make sense if you think about it. You're the one who ended up with everything." That conversation ended badly. Rebecca didn't fully side with Denise, not at first, but she pulled back from me, unwilling to pick a side in a fight she didn't fully understand yet. For the better part of 2 months, my own sister and I barely spoke, and I felt that isolation on top of the grief, on top of the legal threat. 3 separate weights stacked on my chest at the same time. Those 2 months were, honestly, the lowest point of the entire ordeal. I was grieving a man who'd raised me in every way that mattered, defending a legacy I hadn't asked to have to defend, and doing it largely alone, because the one person who should have been standing next to me was 3 states of doubt away, unsure whether to trust her own brother. I'd come home from work, walk through a house that suddenly felt too quiet, and sit with the weight of it until it got late enough to justify going to bed. There were nights I genuinely wondered if it was worth fighting for 150 acres if it meant losing my relationship with my sister in the process. I didn't have an answer for that yet. I just kept working the problem, because it was the only thing I knew how to do with the anger. Denise didn't stop at rumors. While the probate claim worked its way through the court system, she took action on the ground. She hired her own surveyor, without contacting me, without any court order, and had him stake a boundary line directly through the orchard, roughly bisecting the 150 acres in half. Wooden stakes with pink survey tape, driven into the ground between rows of trees Walter had grafted by hand 3 decades earlier. I found out about the stakes from a neighbor who called me, confused, asking why there was a survey crew out there without me. I drove out that same afternoon and stood in the orchard looking at pink tape tied to a stake driven 6 inches from a tree Walter had planted the summer I turned 11. The surveyor Denise had hired, a younger guy I didn't recognize from the county's usual roster, was still packing up his equipment when I got there. He looked up, saw my face, and had the good sense to look uncomfortable. "I was told this was uncontested," he said. "It's very contested," I said. "There's an active probate case on this property. Did anyone tell you that?" He didn't answer, which told me everything I needed to know. He finished loading his truck and left without another word, and I stood alone in the orchard for a long time afterward, looking at stakes driven through rows my grandfather had grafted by hand, feeling something shift in me from grief into something harder and more focused. As a licensed surveyor myself, I can tell you plainly what those stakes actually meant. Legally, nothing. Here's a knowledge nugget worth understanding if you're ever in a property dispute. A private survey, commissioned unilaterally by one party without agreement from the other owner or a court order, carries no legal weight in establishing a boundary line. It's not evidence. It's not binding. It's essentially a physical opinion staked into the ground, and until a court validates it, it means exactly as much as if I'd walked out there and moved the stakes myself. which, for the record, I did not do, no matter how tempting it was standing there that afternoon. But it wasn't really about the legal weight. It was about intimidation, about staking a physical claim in front of anyone who drove past, about sending a message to the rest of the family that Denise's version of events was already being treated as fact. A few weeks after that, Denise escalated again. She contacted the county assessor's office and attempted to file a competing property tax record, listing herself as a partial owner of the estate based on her pending probate claim. That move created a genuine mess. The assessor's office, understandably cautious about a contested estate, flagged the entire property, which meant I couldn't move forward with routine maintenance permits, couldn't finalize the transfer of utilities into my name, and couldn't even confirm with certainty who the county considered the legal owner of record while the flag was active. I spent an entire afternoon at the assessor's office trying to untangle it, sitting across from a clerk who kept apologizing while explaining, over and over, that her hands were tied until the probate matter resolved. It was maddening in a very specific way. Denise hadn't proven anything. She'd simply filed a piece of paper, and that single piece of paper was now capable of freezing 150 acres of active farmland, an orchard that needed maintenance, irrigation that needed servicing. All of it stalled because a county office had no choice but to treat an unproven claim as a live dispute. Here's the second knowledge nugget, because it matters if you ever find yourself dealing with a contested inheritance. County assessor offices generally aren't equipped and aren't authorized to make legal determinations about disputed ownership. They exist to track tax liability, not to settle inheritance disputes. When Denise filed that competing record, she wasn't strengthening her legal position at all. She was creating administrative friction, the kind designed to wear down an opponent through sheer exhaustion rather than actually winning anything in court. And it was working. Between the family rumors, the staked orchard, the assessor's office mess, and the grief I hadn't even had a real chance to process yet, I was worn thin in a way I didn't fully recognize until Rebecca and I had our second, harder conversation a few weeks later. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, arms crossed, eyes red. "Did you do anything Grandpa didn't want?" "No," I said. "Rebecca, I promise you, no." "Then why does she have a document that says otherwise?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm going to find out." That was the moment I stopped waiting for the legal system to sort itself out on its own timeline and started doing what I actually knew how to do. I pulled every historical deed record I could access, going back to Walter's original 1963 land grant. I requested certified copies of every survey correction on file with the county. I went through the metal box in Walter's study myself, the one he'd kept his entire paper trail in for 61 years, cross-referencing every document against the county's official records. Late nights became the norm. I'd get home from a full day of survey work, eat something standing up at the kitchen counter, and then spread Walter's records across my dining table until well past midnight, comparing dates, comparing signatures, comparing anything I could get my hands on against the document Denise had filed. I wasn't trained in forensic document analysis, not formally, but I knew enough about how legal paperwork was supposed to look, feel, and hold together to know that something about her filing felt off from the very first read. The paper stock seemed slightly different from anything else in Walter's records. The signature, while a reasonable surface-level match, lacked the small, consistent tremor his hand had developed in his final 2 years from a minor tremor condition, a detail that would only be visible to someone who'd watched him sign things regularly during that period. I had. It took 3 weeks of late nights, but I found something. Buried in the notarization block of Denise's supposed amended will, there was a notary license number. I ran it against the state's public notary registry out of pure professional habit, the same instinct that makes me double-check every stamp on every survey I certify. The license number didn't match any notary registered in the state during the relevant time period. Not an expired license, not a lapsed one, a number that had never been issued to anyone, ever. I checked it 3 separate times, refreshing the registry, certain I'd made an error somewhere. I hadn't. I sat at my kitchen table at nearly midnight, staring at that discrepancy. And for the first time since the certified letter arrived, I felt something other than grief and exhaustion. I felt certainty. Whatever Denise had filed with the court, it wasn't just aggressive or opportunistic. It was fraudulent, and I now had the first thread proving it. The next morning, I called Nora Fitzgerald and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment on the phone, then said the words that set the next phase of this entire fight into motion. "If that number doesn't check out," she said, "we're not looking at a disputed inheritance anymore, Thomas. We're looking at forgery. I want a forensic document examiner on this immediately." "How fast can we move on that?" I asked. "Fast," Nora said. Because if I'm right about what this is, the sooner we get an expert's signature on a report, the sooner a judge can put an end to this. Bring me everything from that metal box, every scrap. We're going to need a full comparison set. I spent the rest of that week gathering documentation, boxing up decades of Walter's careful record keeping, and driving it to Nora's office myself, rather than trusting it to anyone else. There was something almost fitting about it, handing over the very paper trail Walter had spent 61 years maintaining. The same box I used to sit next to as a kid without understanding its weight, now serving as the evidence that would unravel a fraud committed in his name. I hung up the phone, looked out at the dark orchard through my kitchen window, and thought about the pink survey tapes still tied to those stakes, marking a line through land that had never legally belonged to anyone but Walter, and now me. I didn't know yet exactly what the forensic report would show. I only knew it was going to end this the right way, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with the truth laid out on a table where nobody could talk their way around it anymore. The forensic document examiner Nora hired was a woman named Eleanor Voss, retired from 22 years with the state crime lab before going into private practice, specializing in question document analysis. She spent 3 weeks with the materials I'd handed over, comparing Denise's supposed amended will against a full set of verified Walter Whitfield signatures pulled from decades of deeds, tax filings, and bank records. I met with her once during that process, in a small office cluttered with magnification equipment and reference binders. She was meticulous in a way that immediately put me at ease, the same way I feel when I watch a good surveyor triple-check a boundary reading before certifying it. She explained that question document analysis isn't about a single obvious tell. It's about accumulating small, independent points of inconsistency until the pattern becomes undeniable. One irregularity could be explained away. A dozen, converging from completely different angles, could not. Her report, when it came back, was more damning than I'd let myself hope for. The signature on the amended will was a reasonable visual match at a glance, close enough to fool a casual eye, but it failed under magnification on 3 separate points of pressure and stroke consistency that Walter's genuine signature always carried, including the tremor his hand had developed in his final 2 years. Whoever forged it had a sample to copy from, likely traced or heavily practiced from an old canceled check or a signed card, but they didn't have Walter's hand. And hands don't lie the way ink can. Eleanor's report noted specifically that the pen lift pattern, the tiny hesitations between letters that develop unconsciously over a lifetime of writing the same name, were absent entirely, replaced by an unnaturally smooth, continuous stroke consistent with careful copying rather than natural signing. The paper itself was the second nail. Fiber analysis dated the paper stock to a manufacturing batch that hadn't entered general office supply distribution until several weeks after Walter's death. It was, quite simply, impossible for that specific paper to have existed on the date it was supposedly signed. Eleanor explained it to me plainly. Paper manufacturers embed subtle, traceable variations into their production runs, and matching a sheet to a batch date is one of the more reliable tools in her field precisely because almost nobody committing this kind of fraud thinks to account for it. And the notary seal, the one I'd already flagged as unregistered, turned out to be a fabricated stamp entirely. Not an error, not an oversight. A deliberately manufactured seal designed to look official, complete with a state emblem rendered just slightly wrong in a way only someone trained to spot forged government seals would catch on first inspection. Nora requested an emergency probate hearing. Judge Harold Simmons, a man who'd presided over that courthouse for 19 years and had a reputation for running an efficient, no-nonsense docket, granted it within 2 weeks. The night before the hearing, Rebecca called me for the first time in nearly 2 months. Not to hash out old doubts, but simply to ask what time I was leaving in the morning. It was a small thing, an ordinary logistical question, but it told me more than any apology could have. She was back. I remember walking into that courtroom with Rebecca beside me for the first time in over 2 months. We hadn't fully repaired things yet, not completely, but when I told her what the forensic report showed, something in her face changed, the doubt finally giving way to something closer to guilt and relief at once. "I should have believed you sooner," she said, in the hallway outside the courtroom, quiet enough that only I could hear it. "You believe me now," I said. "That's what matters today." "I let her get in my head," Rebecca said. "I keep thinking about that, how easy it was for her to make me doubt you. I'm sorry, Thomas." "We'll talk about it after," I said. "Right now, I need you next to me in there." She nodded, and we walked in together, side by side, the way we probably should have been standing since the day the certified letter first arrived. Denise arrived with her attorney, a heavyset man named Philip Ostrander, who I'd later learn had taken her case largely on contingency, betting on a quick settlement rather than a real fight. She walked in wearing a tailored blazer, sharper and more expensive looking than anything I'd seen her wear before all of this started, and I remember thinking, with a cold kind of clarity, that she'd already started spending money she didn't have and had no legal right to. She sat down at the opposing table with the same thin, controlled smile from the will reading months earlier. She leaned toward her attorney and said something I couldn't hear, and he chuckled, low and confident, the sound of a man who thought he was about to walk through a routine hearing. Judge Simmons called the hearing to order. Nora presented first, walking the court through the timeline: Walter's death certificate, dated and certified, the amended will's notarization date, 3 weeks later. The impossibility, on its face, of a dead man signing a legal document. She spoke methodically, laying each document on the record one at a time, giving the judge no room to interpret anything as ambiguous. This wasn't a case built on suspicion or family drama, she made clear. It was a case built on dates, seals, and paper that could be independently verified against objective, physical evidence. Ostrander objected, calling it circumstantial, insisting dates could be clerical errors, that his client had acted in good faith based on documents provided to her by a third party she trusted. Your Honor, Nora said, we have more than dates. She submitted Eleanor Voss's forensic report into evidence. The courtroom went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something breaks open. Judge Simmons read through the report himself, slowly, flipping pages, his expression giving away nothing, until he set it down and looked directly at Denise. Ms. Calloway, he said, your attorney has represented that you received this document from a third party you trusted. I'd like to know who that third party is. Denise's composure cracked for the first time all morning. She glanced at Ostrander, who looked, for the first time, genuinely uncertain rather than confidently rehearsed. A friend, Denise said, her voice thinner than it had been a moment ago. Someone who said they could help me file the paperwork properly. I didn't know there was anything wrong with it. You didn't know the notary seal was fabricated, Judge Simmons said, on a document that happened to name you as a 50% beneficiary of 150 acres. I trusted the wrong person, Denise said. That may be, Judge Simmons said, but trust isn't a legal defense against filing a fraudulent claim with this court. Ostrander tried to regroup, requesting a continuance to allow his client time to identify this supposed third party and gather her own evidence. Judge Simmons denied it, noting that Denise had already had months to produce any corroborating information and had produced none. Nora called me to briefly testify to my direct eyewitness account of Walter's physical condition and mental state in the final week of his life, the same week the forged document claimed to have been signed 3 weeks later. I described what I'd already told Rebecca in that kitchen conversation weeks earlier, plainly, without embellishment. He was lucid, but weak. He could barely hold a pen steady enough to sign the hospital paperwork the hospice nurse needed, let alone travel to a notary's office he supposedly visited from beyond the grave. Ostrander tried a brief cross-examination, asking whether I'd had any private conversations with Walter about the estate in his final months that hadn't been documented anywhere. I told him the truth. Yes, we'd talked about the land many times over the years, always consistent with the will he'd already signed 4 years earlier. Ostrander asked if I could prove those conversations happened. I said I couldn't, the same way nobody could prove any private conversation between two people, but that the forensic evidence didn't require anyone to take my word for anything. It spoke for itself. When I stepped down, I looked at Denise directly for the first time since the hearing started. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the table in front of her. The confident posture from an hour earlier completely gone. Judge Simmons took a short recess, and when he returned, he didn't waste time. I watched him settle back into his chair, adjust the folder in front of him, and take a breath before speaking, the kind of deliberate pause a man takes when he's about to say something he wants, remembered exactly as he says it. This court has reviewed the forensic findings, the impossible timeline, and the fabricated notarization presented in support of the claimant's amended will, he said. There is zero legal basis for this claim. The room stayed silent for a beat after he said it. I felt Rebecca's hand find mine under the table, gripping it tightly. Somewhere behind us, I heard one of my aunts exhale audibly, a sound somewhere between relief and disbelief. The amended will is ruled invalid and struck from the estate record in its entirety, Judge Simmons continued. The original will, naming Thomas Whitfield as sole heir, stands as the sole legal instrument governing this estate. Furthermore, given the evidence of a fabricated notary seal and forged signature, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal fraud investigation. Ostrander's face went pale. He leaned toward Denise and whispered something urgent, his composure from the start of the hearing completely gone. Denise didn't respond to him. She sat frozen, staring straight ahead, absorbing a ruling that had just erased both her claim to the land and her ability to walk away from this quietly. Judge Simmons closed the folder in front of him, glanced once more at both tables, and added a final note for the record. Let it also be noted that this court takes fraudulent estate filings seriously, precisely because they exploit grieving families at their most vulnerable. This ruling should serve as a clear resolution, both legally and for the family present here today. With that, he adjourned the hearing. Word moves fast in a small courthouse, and faster in a small extended family. By the time we walked out into the hallway, two of my aunts who'd been swayed by Denise's version of events months earlier were already there, having come to watch the hearing themselves. I watched their faces as they took in what had just happened, watched the realization land, watched one of them walk straight past Denise without a word and come find me instead. "I'm sorry, Thomas," my aunt said. "I should have known better." "You didn't know what I didn't know either, until today," I said. There wasn't much satisfaction in it. Mostly just relief, heavy and exhausting, the kind that comes after months of carrying something you couldn't fully put down. The other aunt, standing a few feet back, looked more shaken than apologetic, still processing the fact that someone in her own family had manufactured a government seal and forged a dead man's signature to steal half an inheritance. "How does someone even do that?" she said quietly, mostly to herself. Nobody had an answer for her. Denise walked out of that courthouse alone. Ostrander didn't walk with her, choosing instead to speak briefly with Nora in the hallway, likely already calculating his own exposure on a case he'd taken, believing it was a straightforward inheritance dispute rather than a fraud referral in the making. Nobody from the family approached Denise. Nobody said a word to her at all. I watched her walk down the courthouse steps by herself, the blazer that had looked so confident an hour earlier now looking like exactly what it was, a costume for a role she no longer had any claim to. She got into her car in the parking lot, and I watched her sit there for a long moment, not starting the engine right away, before finally driving off. The same woman who'd staked a boundary through my grandfather's orchard now facing a criminal fraud referral and a family that had finally seen the truth clearly enough to stop believing her. Rebecca squeezed my hand again as we watched her go. "It's over," she said. "Most of it," I said, "but I think we're just getting to the part that actually matters." She looked at me, a question in her eyes, and I realized I wasn't just talking about the criminal referral or the paperwork that still needed to be finalized to formally close the estate. I was talking about everything that came after winning. The orchard still needed tending. The family still needed mending, in more places than just the two of us. And somewhere in all of it, I still needed to figure out how to honor the promise I'd made Walter at his bedside. The one about keeping the land whole, now that the fight to protect it was finally, legally, over. 3 weeks after the hearing, the probate court formally closed the estate. Every document was finalized, every record corrected, the county assessor's flag lifted, the fraudulent property tax filing expunged entirely from the record. The 150 acres, the farmhouse, the orchard, the timber rights, all of it, legally and completely mine, exactly as Walter had intended 4 years before he ever got sick. Nora called me the morning the final paperwork went through. And I remember standing in my kitchen listening to her walk through each cleared item on the list, one by one, the same list that had felt impossibly tangled just months earlier. The assessor's competing filing, gone. The illegitimate boundary claim, struck from the record. The amended will itself, formally voided and sealed as evidence in an ongoing criminal matter. By the time she finished reading it off, I realized I'd been holding my breath through most of it, a habit I didn't even know I'd developed over the past year of legal uncertainty. I drove out to the property the same afternoon the final paperwork cleared, alone, and walked the boundary line for the first time without any lingering uncertainty hanging over it. The pink survey tape was still tangled around a few of the stakes Denise's surveyor had driven months earlier. I pulled every single one of them out of the ground myself, one at a time, and stacked them in the bed of my truck, like evidence of a war that was finally, officially over. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over land once a fight for it is finally done. I stood in the middle of the orchard for a long time that afternoon, not doing anything in particular, just letting that silence settle over me the way it hadn't been able to for the better part of a year. Denise's consequences unfolded slower than the courtroom drama had. the way legal consequences usually do. The district attorney's office opened a formal fraud investigation within a month of the referral. I won't pretend to know every detail of where that investigation eventually led, because I chose, deliberately, not to follow it obsessively. I'd spent almost a year of my life consumed by what Denise had done. I wasn't willing to give her another year of my attention now that the estate itself was settled. What I do know is that a fabricated notary seal and a forged signature on a legal document are serious charges in this state, carrying real potential consequences, and that Denise retained a criminal defense attorney separate from Ostrander within weeks of the referral going through. I heard, secondhand through a relative who still spoke to her occasionally in those early weeks, that she'd tried once more to shift blame onto the mysterious friend she'd mentioned in the courtroom, offering investigators a name that reportedly led nowhere, a dead end that only made her own position look worse. I don't know if that detail is entirely accurate. Family information travels through enough filters that I've learned to hold secondhand accounts loosely. What I do know for certain, because I saw the paperwork myself, is that the fraud referral remained active, and that Denise's financial situation, already unstable before any of this started, grew considerably worse once legal fees from both the failed probate claim and her own criminal defense began stacking up. The family consequences were, in some ways, harder on her than anything the legal system could impose. Word of what she'd done spread through every branch of the extended family within days of the hearing. The aunts who'd once taken her calls, listened to her concerns, repeated her version of events to anyone who'd listen, stopped answering when she called. She wasn't invited to Thanksgiving that year. Nobody made a formal announcement about it. It simply happened, the natural consequence of a family finally seeing clearly who'd been telling the truth and who'd been manufacturing a story to steal from a dead man's legacy. Rebecca and I spent the months after the hearing rebuilding what those 2 silent months had worn down. It wasn't instant. Trust doesn't snap back into place just because a judge rules in your favor. But we started spending Sundays out at the farm together again, the way we used to as kids, walking the orchard rows, talking through everything that had happened, slowly filling in the gap Denise's manipulation had carved between us. The first few Sundays were quiet, almost tentative, both of us circling around the subject without quite landing on it directly. It took nearly a month before Rebecca finally said what I think she'd been carrying since the hearing. I keep thinking about how close it came to actually working, Rebecca told me one Sunday, sitting on the porch steps of the farmhouse, looking out at the orchard in late afternoon light. If you hadn't caught that notary number, if you hadn't had the forensic background to even know what to look for. I think about that too, I said. But Grandpa always said, watch the paper, not the people. I didn't understand what he meant until I actually had to do it. She was quiet for a moment. He knew something, didn't he? Near the end. I don't know if he knew specifically, I said, but I think he knew enough to leave me prepared. That was always how he operated. Prepare for the thing you hope never happens. I'm still sorry, Rebecca said, for doubting you, even for a little while. I should have known better than to let her get inside my head like that. You were grieving too, I said. She knew exactly which cracks to press on, and grief opens up cracks in everybody. I don't hold it against you. I never did. Not really. I was angry at the situation, never really at you. She reached over and squeezed my hand, the same gesture that had carried us through the courtroom months earlier, and for the first time since the certified letter had arrived at my house, it felt like the two of us were fully, completely back on the same side. No lingering hesitation left between us. That conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward, enough that I finally went back into the farmhouse study, into the same room where that metal box of records had sat for 61 years, and started going through the rest of what Walter had kept there beyond just deeds and surveys. Buried near the bottom, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, I found his field journal, a battered leather notebook filled with decades of handwritten notes on the orchard's expansion, planting schedules, grafting techniques, notes on which rows produced best in which years. It wasn't a legal document. It was something better. It was Walter's actual voice, preserved in his own handwriting, decades of quiet devotion to a piece of land he'd built from nothing. I recognized the handwriting from the earliest entries immediately, steady and confident. The same hand that had signed the will 4 years before his death. The same hand the forger had failed to authentically replicate no matter how carefully they'd traced it. I sat on the farmhouse floor that evening and read through the entire journal in one sitting, working backward from decades-old entries about his very first grafting attempts, half of which he noted had failed outright, to more recent entries chronicling the orchard's best seasons. There was an entry from the year I turned 11, the same summer he'd planted the tree Denise's stakes had ended up driven 6 inches from. He'd written simply, Grandson helped plant the East Row today. Told him someday this tree will outlive both of us. He didn't quite believe me. He will someday. Reading that line nearly undid me. I sat there on the floor of that study for a long time after, letting myself feel the full weight of everything. The grief I'd never fully processed, the exhaustion of the fight, and underneath all of it, a quiet, steady gratitude that he'd left me not just land, but a record of exactly why the land mattered. Near the final entries, written in a hand that had clearly started to shake with age, he'd written something that felt less like a farming note and more like a message he'd left for whoever eventually found it. The land will always outlast the people who try to take shortcuts to it. Protect it the honest way, plank by plank, root by root, and it will protect you back. I closed that journal and sat with it in my lap for a long while, understanding, finally and completely, that the fight I'd just been through hadn't been separate from the life he'd lived. It had been the exact test he'd spent decades quietly preparing me to pass, whether either of us had known it at the time or not. I decided, not long after finding that journal, what I wanted to do with the land going forward beyond simply keeping it running as a working orchard. Walter had built everything here on the foundation of a veteran's land grant, a debt of gratitude to a country that gave a young man coming home from Korea a real chance to build something permanent. I wanted to honor that directly. I set aside a small section near the eastern ridge, the section with the best view of the whole property, to eventually develop into a modest veterans memorial grove, a quiet place for local veterans and their families to visit, walk, and remember, funded in part by the orchard's own proceeds each season. I've already reached out to a local veterans organization about the idea, and the response was more enthusiastic than I expected. Several members offered to help plan the layout, suggesting a small walking path lined with trees, a simple stone marker honoring Walter's service alongside space for other local veterans' names in the years ahead. It's still early, mostly sketches and conversations at this point, but I can already picture it clearly. The same ridge where Walter used to sit some evenings looking out over land he'd spent his whole life earning, now serving as a quiet gathering place for other men and women who understood exactly what that kind of sacrifice meant. It felt like the right way to close the loop Walter had opened 61 years earlier, turning a story that started with someone trying to steal a piece of his legacy into something that gave back to the exact community he'd come from. These days, when I walk the orchard in the evening, the boundary lines are clean again. No pink tape, no stakes driven through rows that don't belong to anyone but the family that planted them. Just 150 acres, whole, exactly the way Walter Whitfield spent 61 years making sure it would stay. Rebecca still comes out most Sundays. My aunts have started visiting again too. Slowly, cautiously, the way people do after trust has been damaged and needs real time to rebuild rather than a single apology to fix. The orchard produced its best harvest in 3 years this past season, and I like to think that's not a coincidence. That land responds, somehow, to being cared for honestly again after a year of being fought over dishonestly. Some evenings I still walk out to that stretch of trees near where the East Row stands. The one Walter and I planted together the summer I turned 11, the same one Denise's illegal stakes ended up driven 6 inches from. I stand there sometimes, just looking at it, thinking about how close this specific tree came to being cut loose from the rest of the land it belongs to, and how strange it is that the same skill Walter passed down to me almost by accident, teaching a kid to read a boundary line for fun on quiet summer afternoons, ended up being the exact thing that saved everything he built. If someone in your own family has ever tried to take something that wasn't legally or morally theirs, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, after everything I went through this year, you're not alone in this. And if you want to know how the criminal fraud investigation into Denise eventually plays out, let me know, because I'll be back with an update the moment there's something real to share. Subscribe if you want to be here when that update comes.